Today we are going to talk about depth of field, technically what determines it and creatively how to use it. My name is Timothy Reese, and I've worked in the television, film, and photography world as a director of photography and a photographer for nearly 20 years. Check out my videos as we cover not only the how, but also the why of various technical and creative techniques used in the creation of real images. Let's say you're recording your subject who's standing 5 feet away from the camera. You set the focus on your lens to 5 feet and that subject should be in focus. Well, depth of field describes how much of that area in front of and behind of your subject will be within acceptable focus. Let's dive a little deeper. First, let's set the record straight because oftentimes I've heard the phrase more depth of field in an attempt to ask for a softer background, as if depth of field equals soft focus and asking for more of it would mean a softer background. Well, this is just plain confusion on the part of those asking for it. Depth of field refers to a specific range of focus. In reality, if you want a softer background, you want less depth of field, not more. Less, also called shallow depth of field, can be very popular to help create a soft background which guides the viewer to focus on what the photographer and cinematographer want. More, also referred to as deeper depth of field, keeps things closer and farther away in focus and can be popular for landscape, architecture, macro, sports, etc., as well as in narrative scenes where you want to see the details of something happening in the background of your foreground subject. Wider lenses will have more depth of field when compared to longer lenses. Larger apertures will have shallower depth of field than smaller apertures. But why? This is primarily due to two factors and their effect on something called the circle of confusion. Bear with me as this is going to get a little technical. So first let's define what the circle of confusion is, and I'll do my best to avoid any more confusion puns. When light passes through a camera lens, it's refracted and ideally should converge to a single point on the sensor. As the light reflected off objects at various distances in front of the camera flows through the lens, it will converge at points in front of and behind the sensor plane. How far away that light converges away from the sensor plane will determine how large the circles of confusion will be. You see, the human eye can only discern a certain size circle of confusion. Anything smaller than this threshold will appear sharp and in focus. Anything larger than this threshold will seem blurry and out of focus. The farther away objects behind and in front of the main focus point are, the larger these circles become, and hence the more out of focus they appear. Okay, now that we have a general understanding of the circle of confusion, let's dive a little deeper into asking our original questions. How does aperture affect depth of field? And why do wider lenses have more depth of field than longer lenses? The size of the aperture directly affects how large of a circle of confusion will be created. With larger apertures, such as an f1.4, the circles will be much larger than that of smaller apertures, such as f16. This means that light from objects outside of our focus point, those landing in front of or behind the sensor plane, will have a larger circle of confusion and look blurrier. This answers the first part of our question, but how does focal length come into play? Remember how the aperture is calculated? That formula f-stop equals focal length divided by the entrance pupil? Well, let's compare the size of the entrance pupil at an f2.8 between a 25mm lens and a 100mm lens using the formula where x is the size of our entrance pupil. First, the 25mm lens, where 2.8, the f-stop, equals 25, the focal length, divided by x, or the entrance pupil. So solving for x means that the size of our entrance pupil for our f2.8 25mm lens is 8.92 millimeters. Now let's do the same thing for the 100mm lens. Again, with an aperture of 2.8 equaling 100 divided by x results in an entrance pupil of 35.71. Since we just learned a moment ago that a larger entrance pupil will create larger circles of confusion, at the same f-stop, the 100mm lens entrance pupil is significantly larger. This means objects that fall outside of that focus plane, again, light being focused either in front of or behind the sensor, will look blurrier on the 100mm compared to the 25. Now that we have a grasp on how aperture and focal length determine depth of field, let's take a look at some practical examples to better understand how this applies to our video and photography work. One thing to note before we go into the calculations is that they are based on a camera using what's called a Super 35 sensor. The size of the camera's sensor and its influence on focal lengths can affect your depth of field calculations, but more on that in another video. Also, as a quick side note, remember when measuring a subject's distance to the camera, always measure to the camera's sensor plane, not the front of the lens. This is usually a few inches behind the lens mount, or even less than an inch on some mirrorless cameras. So let's move on to our example. A camera with a 50mm lens is focused on a medium shot of a person 7 feet away, which creates a nice medium close-up. With the aperture set at f5.6, your image should stay objectionably sharp enough from 6 foot 6 inches to 7 foot 7 inches away from the sensor. That's the range. Meaning your total depth of field is around 1 foot 2 inches. If the image was too dark, however, and you needed to open up 2 stops to an f2.8, the depth of field would change dramatically to only 6.9 inches of total depth. 6 foot 9 inches on the close side, 7 foot 4 inches on the far side. One can see how focus can be made more challenging in low light environments when a wide aperture is needed. From what we learned about the circles of confusion, depth of field is affected by more than just the aperture. The two other major contributors are the focal length of the lens that is used and the subject distance to your camera. In regards to changing the focal length, using the same measurements as before, let's change from a 50mm to an 85mm. Now our f5.6 aperture has only 4.8 inches of acceptable focus, and the 2.8 aperture is even shallower at only 2.4 inches. At that limited amount of depth of field, it's almost impossible to keep someone's face in focus from the front of their nose to their ears. Now, let's touch on the third final factor I just briefly mentioned, and that is a subject closer to the lens will have the light rays reflected off of them, focused onto the sensor over a shorter distance of time, and thus the depth of field will be shallower. A subject farther away from the lens will have the opposite effect, with the light rays taking a longer distance to converge, and hence creating a larger range of acceptable focus. Let's go back to the 50mm lens from earlier. We're going to move our subject from 7 feet away to 15 feet away. Now, our 5.6 aperture, which originally had 1 foot, 2 inches of acceptable focus, now has 5 feet, 5.2 inches of total depth. And that 2.8 aperture would go from just under 7 inches to well over 2 feet of total depth. Depth of field is a technical limitation of optics, but one that should be controlled creatively whenever possible. Shallow depth of field is reflective of narrative and theatrical experiences, just as the motion seen in the 24 frames per second frame rate. These are all a result of the equipment that for over 100 years has created these images. Because of this, many people will choose to use a shallow depth of field when they want to convey the emotion and suspension of disbelief that a cinematic experience creates. Shallow depth of field also implies quality, as not too long ago, the ability to create it was limited to the use of expensive cameras. But now, shallow depth of field can be achieved in most professional video cameras and many consumer models on the market. Now, with all the buzz about super soft shallow depth of field, you should keep in mind that too shallow is not necessarily a good thing. If you have two people sitting next to each other in an interview, you might want them both to be in focus. If your depth of field is too shallow, it will be distracting if one subject is slightly softer than the other. However, perhaps you want to create this exact thing. Preferring to keep your primary subject in focus instead and then rack focusing back and forth to whoever is speaking. And if that's what you want, by all means, go ahead. It's a creative choice. Deep focus can sometimes also be desired if you want to showcase the environment your subject is in. Let's say you had an awesome production design budget and want to showcase all that well-spent money. Or shooting stacked action, where we want to see what's happening with our foreground and background subjects simultaneously. Shallow focus can be a lifesaver. Similar to how you might have had a lot of money in the deep focus example for production design, sometimes you don't. and having a softer background means less detail can be seen in your sets. If your art budget isn't very high, this might be ideal. Overexposure in soft, blurry backgrounds is much more forgiving than in backgrounds that are in sharp focus. This can often let you get away with blown out windows and backgrounds that will look more organic if you do not have the lighting budget to expose them correctly. Knowing your depth of field calculations in advance will help you to determine your lighting plan so that you can achieve the desired amount of depth of field by providing enough light to use the aperture that will deliver it to you. Like I mentioned earlier, depth of field is a creative choice, regardless of if the focus is being adjusted automatically or manual, is deep or shallow. Knowing how to control the depth of field, to dial it into what you want as an artist, is an important tool in your kit. If you like these videos, please subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment about a future video you might want me to make. This user feedback really helps me see what users are looking for and ensures I can continue to make helpful and educational videos. Until next time, thanks for watching.